It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Dominic Bryan today. He's the director of the Institute of Irish Study at Queen's University in Belfast and is the chair of diversity challenges and the former chair of the Democratic Dialogue, Ireland's first think tank. Dominic is an anthropologist researching political rituals, commemoration, public space, and identity in Northern Ireland. He's conducted detailed research on parades in Northern Ireland since 1991. In 2001, he was a part of the CLEO group that evaluated government funding to victims groups in Northern Ireland. Since 2001, Dominic has undertaken extensive research into the use of symbols, particularly flags in Northern Ireland. His research, funded by OFMDFM, was one of the key indicators of the shared future policy, and he was a member of the Flags Protocol Review Group. Dominic is a member of the Living Memorial subgroup of Healing Through Remembering, and is part of a number of research projects examining the process of commemoration. He has also worked with the Northern Ireland Human Rights Commission and the Northern Ireland Community Relations Council. And we've asked Dr. Bryan to visit us here in Doha as part of our Zones of Conflict, Zones of Peace program. So we're really happy to host him today for lunch. Welcome, Dr. Bryan.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sheena. And first of all, I'd like to thank you for the invite. And Catherine and Sheena and Brendan, I've been treated very, very well here. And it's an absolute pleasure. In my younger days, I did very little traveling. So even to this day, although I get around the world quite a lot, I find it a real pleasure to visit new places. So thank you very much for that. I'm going to talk about something today which, when I give this paper, I often get two very distinctive reactions. There are people who get very angry at it and think that somehow I'm morally ignoring what is taking place in the world, and that it's shameful that I should even suggest that there isn't really anything called terrorism, all right? There are others, I have to say, who think what I have to say is so blindingly obvious that it's not worthy of an academic paper, all right? You can make up your mind which camp you fall into as we go in, and I might say any heckling or shouting during the event is also quite acceptable. And I know that people have to go off. If I ramble on and people have to head off for things, I understand that as well. But if people want to stay on and argue with me afterwards, then I'll enjoy the debate. So what I want to do, this paper came. This is Georgetown's fault that I did this paper. Could Craig Zelizer over in your Washington campus persuaded me to talk about this to one of his classes, I think in 2008. And it comes out of a long-term concern I have had with how people understand violence and what I would call political violence. And it also comes out of the fact that in Northern Ireland, you'll know we had high levels of violence in Northern Ireland particularly between 1969 and then a peace agreement in 1998. And as a result of that agreement, people who had been defined as terrorists are now in government. Indeed, our Deputy First Minister is Martin McGuinness, who is an admitted member of the Irish Republican Army, an organisation which still, under British legislation, is deemed a terrorist organisation. So in the UK, we actually have a senior member of local government who is defined under law as terrorist. This seems to me to be a somewhat ridiculous situation, and has always demanded that we think about the language we use when we're understanding political violence. So that's what I want to talk about. The other reason I think this is important is because absolutely vast amounts of money, particularly US dollars, have been thrown at trying to understand terrorism. And I'm going to argue that the vast majority of it is completely wasted because it is impossible to use that category of terrorism as a reasonable, analytical, academic category. It really, the minute you start looking at how they do it, it all falls apart. Now, that would be all right if we weren't spending loads of money and running whole foreign policies on it, but the reality is we spend vast amounts of money, have fought at least one war, possibly two wars based on it. All right? So for me, some sort of critical analysis of the whole area is important. So I'm gonna talk through, I'm gonna do three things. I'm gonna talk toward the end a little bit about Northern Ireland and the peace process. In the middle, I'm going to look more closely at how I think terrorism is analysed. But to begin with, what I would like to do is to make an argument about the way the definition of terrorism is used. And I want to sort of look at the types of violence which get described as terrorism, because the word was probably originally used during the French Revolution. It has been used by a whole range of groups of people since. It didn't start as a particularly negative word. In fact, some groups have quite enjoyed being called terrorists, but in recent years it's become a heavily pejorative term. All right. And as an anthropologist, what I think is critically important in understanding the nature of violence is to look at the meaning of the event. What are the reasons and the context through which people use violence, and how is it understood afterwards? And it's my contention that by labelling something with terrorism, we do exactly the opposite. We disguise the meaning of the event. We make an assumption about why people have used that violence, and we put it into a category which means it's very difficult to explore. So, just to get the juices thinking, I've put up a list of things which could or could not be described as terrorism, and I'll come back to a few of them when I go into it. From Northern Ireland, I'll give you a range of events. In July 1972, the IRA planted 22 bombs in the centre of the city. It had a 30-minute phone warning. They blamed the police for not clearing the city, the whole of the city, in 30 minutes. Interestingly, in our peace process, the IRA have apologised for that event and have taken responsibility for it. On the other hand, the IRA also carried out many attacks on police stations. In 1985, a very vicious attack on Newry police station in the southern part of Northern Ireland. Also killed 9 police officers. Why do I put those two together? Well, you've immediately got an example of what the nature of terrorism becomes problematic, because of course an attack on a police station is an attack on armed individuals, the police, which is different from civilians, and yet that attack was also defined as a terrorist attack. So I'm going to begin to pull apart how the definition works. On the other hand, we had loyalist groups, the UDA, and I'll come back to them. The UDA was founded in 1971 as a vigilante group that was protecting Protestant areas, as they saw it, from attacks from Catholic areas. So they marched around areas to defend their space. All right, and the foundation of that organisation is important to understand, because again, they are now categorised as a terrorist organisation. They did in fact go along and commit some very awful sectarian murders. The one I put up there on the Ormer Road in Belfast, they just walked into a booking agency and machine gunned people because that area is a Catholic area, killing 5 people. But the reason I put that up is because as an organisation, they have quite a complex evolution, and the sort of things that they have done over the years, both violent things and non-violent things, varies quite widely. And I would argue that to understand that group and the violence that group, you have to take very seriously who they are and where they've come from, all right? The British state defines them simply as terrorists, and therefore all of the acts that they commit are defined as terrorism, all right? And you can think of a whole plethora of events, and I've listed some of them up there. Some of them you will go, surely that's not terrorism, and others you will go, yes, well that's obviously terrorism. So you notice that I've got America dropping the bomb on Hiroshima in 1945, and that wouldn't normally be categorized as such, although I'm obviously going to make the argument that if you think terrorism is about the use of violence for political means when you are killing lots of civilians to try and make a point, then dropping a bomb on Hiroshima absolutely falls into that category. That was the point of it. It was a strategic attack on a whole load of civilians, which was to scare Japan into surrendering, all right? You might morally justify it or not justify it, but a lot of definitions of terrorism, that would be defined as terrorism. So I put up there a whole load of different examples just to make you think about what we might or might not describe as terrorism. Okay, so I want to think a little bit about how you make the definition. And I come from a background of doing what you might call peace and reconciliation work, and I was almost oblivious to the fact that there was something called terrorism studies until I went to a conference, a political science conference, and they had this event when they had a number of people talking about their studies of terrorism. And when I raised my hand and said, what do you mean by terrorism, a huge argument broke out with the people on the panel, because it was clearly the 3 people giving papers had absolutely no agreement at what it is. And I thought, well, this is interesting. There seems to be a whole area of study there where nobody seems to know what they're talking about, all right? So I started looking up some of the definitions. And there were, for a long time, people argued that there is no valid academic area of study around it. But it's extraordinary how many books there are written on terrorism, and nearly all of them do the same thing. They all spend a chapter trying to define what it is. They all find it almost impossible to do, all right? And then all of them go along talking about it, having realised that it's almost impossible to talk about, all right? Sort of coming up with their own definition, all right? And I'll have a look at them. And the problematic nature of it was revealed when I looked up what the United States State Department's definition of terrorism was in 2003. And you can see that they accepted then that there was no definition of terrorism. The term terrorism means premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatants, I've starred that because we'll come back to non-combatants, targeted by subnational groups or clandestine agents usually intended to influence an audience. All right, now I'll come back to all of those issues. They had to change that very quickly, because if you look closely, you'll notice that 9/11 does not fall into that category. All right, because the minute at 9/11 the Pentagon was attacked, you were attacking, bluntly, the most powerful military base on the planet. All right? So actually the State Department then had to change its definition of non-combatant, which is why it starred there, to include military service people who are unarmed, plus military service people who are armed and are attacked by a group that we have not declared war on. In other words, terrorist attacks by America, or terrorist attacks on America are defined as anybody really that we didn't want to go to war to that attacks us. All right, you've now got a category so enormous, it's almost unworkable. Because of course, in the end, this is a political category, not an analytical category. And you've got all sorts of books that you can go to where they will give you long, very emotive definitions. And of course it is emotive, all right? Because the stuff that happened, political violence, is horrible, all right? It is emotive stuff. And that's one particular definition. But looking at some of the more, as it were, reputable books, this Gupta book looked at all of the sort of definitions and came to the conclusion, and this is rather typical, came to the conclusion that there was no one definition for terrorism that worked, and like many other authors then decided that they would try and define it themselves, and ends up with terror, terrorism, and terrorist as one of the broadest possible connotations as politically motivated violent attacks by non-state actors. Just as the non-combatants category is interesting, the non-state actor is one of the other themes that I'll come back to, because that very quickly breaks down the minute you look at things. Clearly mindful of its political implications and corresponding sundry shortcomings. All right. And Bruce Hoffman, who's one of the best read in this area, points out, as I'll come back to, that it's a highly pejorative term. And his definition, that terrorism is political in aims and motives, violent threatens violence, designed to have far-reaching psychological repercussions, conducted either by an organisation with identifiable claims and command, or by individuals or a small collection of individuals directly. Even the length of these definitions, by the way, gives away how problematic they are. Motivated or inspired by the ideological aims or example of some existent terrorist movement, perpetrated by subnational groups or non-state entity. Now, compare that with my friend and former colleague, Richard English, who's written a lot on the Northern Ireland problem. His very even longer definition, terrorism involves heterogeneous violence used or threatened with a political aim. Threatened is interesting. So now it's not only the act of violence, but terrorism is also the threat of violence as well. How big is this category becoming? It can involve a variety of acts of targets and of actors. It possesses an important psychological definition, producing terror or fear among a directly threatened group, and also wider implied audience in the hope of maximising political communication and achievement. It embodies the exerting and implementing of power and the attempted redress of power relations. It represents a subspecies of warfare, and as such, it can form part of a wider campaign of violent and non-violent attempts at political leverage. Now, you'll notice that Richard, compared to Bruce Hoffman, misses out the non-state actor at all. All right? So even these two key theorists on the area have an utterly different view on what terrorism is. One of them believes that, which I think most of the people doing the research want to look at, which is non-state actors, which I'll argue in a minute is perfectly reasonable to look at. Why non-state actors use particular forms of political violence, I think is a perfectly reasonable. The other one, quite reasonably, Richard English, wants to include state actors because, as we all know, state actors frequently use forms of violence, all right, in order to gain what they want in a forms of psychological warfare. When the UN/US/UK invaded Iraq for the second time, they called their campaign Shock and Awe. All right, which is a good definition for terror. Okay, so they even named their operation, all right, in a way that it was going in so big, so hard, that we were just going to make the state crumble almost immediately. Okay, so state actors use it as a strategy all the time. So Richard's argument is that terrorism should include state actors. Bruce Hoffman's argument is that no, we want to look at non-state actors. All right, and these are two of the key informed people in this area. Then, of course, we have that inevitable problems that for a long time the terrorist is a bad guy until they become good guys. And the late and great Nelson Mandela, of course, right up until 2008, was on American books as a terrorist. All right, because apparently blowing up a few telegraph poles and various other things, and because basically, bluntly, because he was a non-state actor, all right, who wasn't prepared to accept the legitimacy of the state and was prepared to accept certain violent behaviour towards the state in which to change things. All right, so embarrassingly, you eventually have to take someone like Nelson Mandela off that list. All right, but for years he was categorised as a terrorist. So, what constitutes a definition? Well, I've sort of pulled apart the bits that I think you find in a definition of terrorism. These are broadly, so I'll go through them very quickly and say why I think they're all hopeless, although I think, as I say, a lot of this is blindingly obvious to anybody who thinks about it. So first of all, it's an act or threat or both of political violence, an act of terror, or to make people terrified. All right. Now, there's a couple of odd things about this. Firstly, pretty much all violence, by definition, if you're is terrifying. Okay. All right. If you're being bombed by high-level bombers, hasn't happened to me, but I reckon it's terrifying. All right, so fairly much all violence is terrifying. And oddly, a lot of people who are supposed to have been terrified are not terrified. So you look at 9/11, all right, it's clearly an awful occasion. Most of us watched it. Some of us had relatives who were working in the building. An awful occasion. Most American people, I would argue, were not terrified by it. Shocked, horrified, angry, all sorts of things. But psychologically, to be terrified is quite a heavy burden to have. So ironically, most people who you want to politically affect by things are not actually terrified. Whereas I'm sure people involved on the day were absolutely terrified. I don't need any convincing of that whatsoever. All right? So all violent acts have emotional reaction, whether it be in something like war, right the way through to acts of personal violence like rape. Okay? So terror and emotional terror are a part of nearly all acts of violence. Therefore, as a definitional thing, I think it really doesn't work at all. The second of the arguments is that you're trying to communicate to people, to try and convince a wider body of your argument, all right, so that you do a horrible act in which you're then going to be able to influence other people to behave differently. That in other words, the act is more than the act itself. It's strategically to communicate to a wider group of people. However, that again breaks down the minute you think of a whole lot of acts of violence which we wouldn't categorise as terrorism. I give you one example, which is capital punishment. All right? Capital punishment is often argued that by using that act of violence, you are communicating to other people that in a way that will deter them from behaving in a particular way. And that, of course, is an act that the state usually enacts. So it seems to me, in fact, that most violence has a symbolic resonance, is an act of communication. In fact, as an anthropologist, I would say all of this has meaning. Okay? Thirdly, the third element is that it, and this is probably the one that resonates with people the most, that it involves civilian targets. All right. Now, first of all, as I mentioned earlier, in Northern Ireland, you really have a problem because most of the paramilitary groups who committed acts which the British government would define as terrorists attacked civilian targets. As I pointed out, the IRA did some horrible attacks which were deliberately aimed at the economic centre of Belfast and Derry, with obvious civilian targets. However, a lot of their attacks were on British military personnel and on the police. All right, so even their strategy is complex in terms of whether there were civilian targets or not. And they would argue, of course, that a lot of their attacks where civilians were killed, the civilians were killed in that famous phrase that is wheeled out by states time and time again as collateral damage. All right, that these civilians were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. You know, and there's a lot of collateral damage. I don't know how much collateral damage US drone strikes have produced in recent years, but you sort of know, you might say you have a target, but then you sort of say, well, that target was so important that, okay, we might have taken a few children and a few innocent people with us, but we just have to do it. It's collateral damage. So nearly everybody ends up killing civilians, all right? There are certainly events where you try and terrify people by aiming at civilians, but I would argue states and non-state actors do that equally. The US bombed Cambodia for about 4 years, through 68 to 72, killing about 10,000 Cambodians, wrecking the country, all right, with high-level bombing. All right, this was to try and change what was taking place. They must have known that the vast majority of people they were killing were civilians, all right? Even high-level bombing in the Second World War involved the British and American bombing of Dresden. It was obvious that most of the people being killed in Dresden were civilians. So really, the combatant, non-combatant argument collapses very, very quickly, all right? It's a very problematic one to have. The next problem is the legal definition. Now, quite a few people have argued that that terrorism comes when you don't have a legally defined war. Now, this one is fairly easy to deal with because usually it's the state that defines whether they're at war or not. So non-state actors have no position to define whether they're at war or not. And even when the state does do it, the legal position of it is absolutely problematic. So, of course, George Bush argued that there was going to be a war against terrorism, and it was only after people put their hand up and said, does that mean that the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay are in fact prisoners of war? When George Bush was then quickly advised that if they were prisoners of war, they had rights under the Geneva Convention, which wasn't what he or his regime wanted to give them, so they then retracted. So no, it's not a war. It's not a war. We haven't declared war. It's just a war. And they got into all sorts of legal issues over what they were trying to do. And the last category is this one around the state and non-state actors. And what most people that want to study political violence are interested in, and this is quite legitimate, is when non-state actors use forms of violence to try and get what they want. All right? And that's an utterly legitimate and study that we need. But why do we need to use such a pejorative term to label it? We do so, I suspect, because often we're morally repulsed by what they do, which is also quite reasonable, but it doesn't provide you with an analytical category with which to reasonably study something. To understand why people do something, you've got to look at the meaning they're giving. You have to take seriously what they're doing. And one of the learnings I've had from years working in Northern Ireland, and this is a very profound learning, is that very ordinary people commit acts of political violence. They were not mad or potentially even bad. They were ordinary people. And those people, in different contexts, in a peace process, became the key people for delivering peace. All right. So for me, what becomes important is not to morally accept what they have done. I do not morally accept the campaigns of the IRA or the UVF or the UDA. And let me be quite clear about that. I'm not making an excuse for anybody. However, it's absolutely important that we take seriously the context and the meaning in which people committed these acts of violence. All right. So, to conclude this section, I think on almost every level, the way that terrorism is used as an analytical category is useless. All right? And the problem is that there are researchers all over the world coming up with numbers of terrorist acts. They've got calculations, they come up with graphs, they'll tell you we've got more terrorism or less terrorism. They'll categorise all sorts of different things in Afghanistan of terrorism or not terrorism, in Iraq of terrorism, when you all know that the complexities of those environments mean the violence that is taking place is being pressured by all sorts of different things taking place. The meaning for real people on the ground is complex. It can't be boxed into a simple category. Okay, so the last and obvious point to make, which almost everybody agrees on, by the way, is that terrorism is a pejorative term, all right, that is usually used by one group to label another group that it does not like. And there's so much of this goes on, you could almost guess that when a new group comes out and demonstrates on the street, that very quickly a state, and all states do this, will start trying to label them terrorism. I was sitting watching reading a paper, having done some work in Vietnam quite a couple of years ago, and there was demonstration on the streets of Bahrain, and I noticed the Bahraini government were very quickly using the T word to describe. The Bahraini government's no different from all the other governments that spend their life trying to out various groups by using the T word to describe who they are. So it's an extremely pejorative term, and therefore as academics it's beholden on us to critically analyse how it is being used, not to accept it as a simple term. So where does this leave us? Well, some very simple sociology, I think, explains what's happening. And Howard Becker, right back in the 60s, came up with stuff called labelling theory. And he pointed out that inevitably groups with power find ways politically of labelling groups without power in ways that put them outside the normative structure. In other words, and this is true of criminals, of all sorts of things, you find ways of making sure that those people that you don't like bluntly are dehumanized. They are behaving in ways that we wouldn't find ourselves acceptable. All right? And that labeling masks the complexities of what people are doing. So if we take a category like terrorism, we label certain groups as terrorist. Okay? So if I take the example I know in Northern Ireland of the IRA, the Irish Republican Army, who fought for and attempted to achieve a united Ireland so that the 6 counties of Northern Ireland would become part of the Republic of Ireland. Now, they are an illegal terrorist organisation under British legislation. They committed a whole range of different forms of violence, right from going on to hunger strikes, so violence on themselves to try and get what they wanted. And many of you all know that there was, in 1981, hunger strikers in the Maze prison who died and in some senses achieved a change. So right from violence on themselves to violence on people in their community, which they wanted to police, so they would kneecap young people who were seen as socially undesirable, through to violence on people on the other side, to Protestants, people who they thought were working for loyalists, to violence on the police, on the British Army, on the state, a whole panoply, to robbing banks so that you can get money for your campaign is another thing. So you've got a whole range of types of violence, all of which ends up in the category of terrorism because you haven't categorized and looked at the act of violence, you've labeled the group. All right, so that everything they do, you're now ignoring the complexities of who they are and you're labeling everything they do in one way. Right? Rather than maybe noticing that a particular group uses particular forms of political violence at one period and then that seems to change at another period, and take seriously the violence that they're using, again, not morally justifying it, but seriously understanding why certain forms of violence are being used at certain points of time. We've seen this in all of our lifetime with the development of campaigns using suicide bombs. You know, that is something that has existed for a long time, but clearly in the last 10 or 12 years, or maybe 15 years, has become a much more significant weapon. Now, it is interesting to ask why that has developed and evolved. What are the processes? What are the ideological processes that have taken place that means those changes? That's a serious academic inquiry, which some people have undertaken, and is interesting and useful, and takes seriously the nature of that act of violence. It doesn't morally justify it, but it takes it seriously. All right? So the important thing is to analyse the act, not the actor. To think of the category as the act, not the actor. And terrorism tends to label the actor, not seriously look at the act. The other section which is problematic, of course, is that this labelling tends to take place around what you call moral panics. The state will argue that the use of violence is somehow destroying the values of our state, what we feel is important. And that in that name, to protect our values, we are usually going to bring in emergency legislation. The Northern Ireland state did it from 1921 onwards. All right? Because we have the threat of Republicans, we're actually going to introduce emergency legislation which almost destroys democracy. And almost every state that says we're under attack, we need emergency legislation, then produces legislation which in itself restricts the rights of its populace. And we saw the US do that with the Homeland stuff and start restricting. And every time somebody puts their hand up, they say, oh, well, we're protecting ourselves against terrorism. You can see that repeated time and time again. And the things that states then get to do in the name of fighting terrorism is extraordinary, despite the fact that the actual risk, the real risk of attacks, which exists, is usually very, very small. Very small. It's there, it's not very nice, we need to look at it, but actually the risk, the actual number of attacks on the American homeland has been very small. Now, I know security people tell me that's because of all the security panoply and all of that sort of stuff. I, frankly, am extremely sceptical of that. The real risk to citizens is small. The way the state has reacted to it is extraordinary. It's a moral panic. It's a way that those with power are able to manipulate their powerful position to maintain their powerful position by telling us, the citizen, that we are at severe risk and they are going to keep us safe. Right. Now, I'm not underestimating that there is a risk. I'm just suggesting that it is completely exaggerated in terms of the way policy is then enacted. This is just an example of classic labeling. 1979, the CIA identified 3,336 incidents of international terrorism between 69 and 79. 2 years later, they managed to have upped it to 6,714, purely because they changed the definition almost overnight to include threats and hoaxes. I mean, that's just an example of how quickly labeling can change the figures. And if you think that's a small thing, you have to see how much money gets spent on calculating the total number of terrorism. The amount of bean counters and number crunchers that work on this stuff, despite the fact there's no definition, is extraordinary. So let me go on and finish up just by talking about, in the last 5 or 6 minutes, talking about Northern Ireland. So why do I think it's a problem? Well, enormous amounts of money are spent on it. However, it's politically loaded. And most importantly, if we want to understand the context and deal with the problem, it is vital that we do two things. We firstly take serious efforts to understand the meaning and the context in which the violence takes place. And that's a painful thing sometimes, because when people do apparently terrible things, you want to dismiss them as mad or outside norm. You don't want to know that the guys that flew those planes into the buildings at 9/11 were normal people. You don't want to know that they might be quite like you and me, because that is a very hard thing to come to terms with. You want to make them mad, bad, or something. It's very difficult, and but in terms of reconciling and coming to a more peaceful future, you have to put yourselves in the shoes of others. That doesn't mean that it's morally right or that you have to agree with them, but you have to try and understand what the context was that takes people to that. And the minute you label something with terrorism, you destroy that context. You assume you know why they did what they did. All right? And in the end, the state will destroy civil liberties in order to defend that. So what do I think we need? I think we need reasonable academic engagement. I think academics need to argue with states about this use of this term, this pejorative term. I think we need to do research on the areas. I think there's a lot of good research out there of people who are looking at the context of violence, where it comes from, how it spreads, and how it's reduced. All right? But as academics, I don't think we can accept the labelling that the state and those with powers put on this. I think we have to point out that this doesn't help the situation, this makes it worse. And we need to humanise what is taking place. And my example for this is Northern Ireland, because of course we had groups that were called terrorists, we had people in prisons, and a real reconciliation and engagement, these people had to be let out. We had to, the guy that planted the Shankill bomb, all right, in, I think it was 94, spent about 3 years in jail for killing people and was let out under the agreement, which you'll understand the victims, indeed many of us in Northern Ireland, found very difficult to deal with. How would the victims of the Oklahoma bomb of Timothy McVeigh, who of course was put to death, have felt if he was released 4 or 5 years after that bomb? It is really difficult stuff. However, overcoming the political difficulties means trying to reconcile people who have committed serious violence. And the Belfast Agreement demanded of people that they understand that most of those who were in prison because of the political context, not because they were criminals. And slowly but surely, although some in Northern Ireland would still define the IRA as terrorists, the language has changed in groups trying to deal with each other. All right? And on the ground work, once you stop labelling people, it gives you at least the opportunity to start some sort of engagement and understanding. I'll miss that out. And just leave you with these two gentlemen, one who's now dead, David Irvine, who was a UVF terrorist, and was a key person in delivering peace and reconciliation in Northern Ireland, a key negotiator, and someone I met and grew to admire, who committed some very violent acts. All right? And Gerry Adams, who is widely still hated in Northern Ireland by Unionists and some nationalists. However, and although he denies being in the IRA, not many people believe that. You know, he would be seen as a senior IRA person. However, you cannot deny that he has very skillfully moved Irish republicanism into a political place of engagement. All right? And has been a key actor in bringing a peace process to Northern Ireland. So that in the end, you end up with the terrorist standing with somebody on the left who's not a terrorist, apparently, although only one of those people is ordering violent attacks at the moment. All right? In a non-war situation. And it was interesting to see, to finish off, how the IRA, through their magazine Unproblak, described the 9/11 attack. And it was with some irony that you might read this. It is too early to assess who is responsible for this attack. No matter who was to blame, it was utterly reprehensible and must be condemned. The deliberate killing of civilians is always wrong. Now, that coming from an Irish Republican group is an odd thing. No matter whether it is governments, armed political groups or individuals who carry it out. Yeah, I think it's nearly always wrong. What I'm not prepared ever to do is to place labels, simple labels on people, and most importantly, in the academic sphere, which is the one I work on most. All right? It is pointless us adhering to such categories. It is absolutely important that we take seriously how political violence is used, to understand its meaning and its context, and come up with comparative categories. Look at non-state actors. Absolutely look at non-state actors, but don't make simple pejorative labels on them, and definitely do not end up bean counting and trying to calculate how much terrorism there is and isn't at any single point. I would suggest to you it is an absolutely worthless task. And when you see figures of how much terrorism there is in the world that's calculated on an annual basis, I put it to you that it is pointless and useless. And all of these people who sort of know that it's impossible to define, they sort of know the world is round and complicated, are basically a version of the flat earth people, who, despite the fact that the earth is round, have to try and stick with an idea that it's flat so that they can do their bean counting. And it really doesn't help us in our academic understanding what has taken place. And secondly, it doesn't help us in trying to reconcile the very, very difficult and real problems we have in the world. Thank you.